Welcome to Strategic Management, and in this presentation I'm going to be talking about diversification, which is an extension of the topic where we looked at Ansoff's strategic directions or product market matrix. So diversification, to remind you, is a strategic direction in which a firm decides to go beyond its existing product range and existing market. And this leads to a very high risky strategy because there are so many unknowns. There's no experience or reputation in the products or markets. So risk can be very high. We can see different forms of diversification or different realms of diversification. The first one is unrelated diversification, where there is genuinely no link between the different businesses within a portfolio that a corporation may control, or there is no link in the move between different areas of operations which an individual firm may be making. So unrelated diversification has the highest risk, whereas related diversification, a level of diversification where there is some link between the businesses in the portfolio or some link in the move that an individual firm makes between products and markets. Related diversification tends to be of a lower risk. So why diversify anyway? One key rationale for diversification is to exploit economies of scope. So we've looked at economies of scale as reducing the unit cost of a product within one firm, but we can also have economies of scope whereby resources are shared across different operations, so giving those resources the opportunity to gain economies and reduce the costs of those individual resources. So that's one attractive option for diversification. Another rationale for diversification is that as the overall corporation grows, then they increase their market power. They can have more power perhaps over suppliers. They can have access to cheaper money to borrow. Or another aspect of increasing market power in a diversified firm is that the profits from one firm can be used to invest in another firm, increasing the power of that invested firm disproportionate to its size in its own marketplace. There's been a common thread in looking at the history of diversification that it's come about because management believe that they can manage any businesses, and so therefore they've not paid so much attention to what it is they're managing, but there is a belief, sometimes founded on fact, that they have particular skills which means they can manage all these different businesses and perhaps exploit where they exist any superior processes or technology that exists within those firms in different markets across different product areas. A classic rationale for diversification is where the markets and products you're currently operating in are declining, and there is little choice but to move away from those and find some other area in which to invest your experience and funds. Another classic approach to diversification is the concept of spreading risk. From a financial perspective, you would never be advised to put all your savings into one sort of asset. Don't put them all into property or all into gold or all into stocks and shares, but choose a variety of different assets to invest in. That same philosophy is sometimes applied to businesses. So therefore, in a portfolio which has got some very risky businesses, the risk can be offset or mitigated by having some more stable businesses within the portfolio. Sometimes diversification, the constant purchase and integration of new businesses within a corporate portfolio, is actually more to do with the ambition of a set of managers than it is to do with good sense and strong strategy. And this sometimes has led to diversification being not seen in the best light by strategists. So let's look at a little bit of more detail about unrelated diversification. Unrelated diversification is a classic move to escape from market decline, and it is often cited as a rationale or a way to spread risk across different businesses, as discussed earlier. It can also be used to even out cyclical effects across different businesses. So, for example, if you had a winter sports equipment and clothing business, most of your revenue would come during a few winter months. So if you then complemented that business with a surf equipment and clothing business, then you could see revenue being achieved at different times of the year. So you'll even out the cyclical effect of the timing of investment and the flow of income. It can also be a way to expend excess cash which has been generated by a successful business, which doesn't have the opportunity to grow any further. So South African breweries at one time had a very high market share in South Africa, generated huge cash flow and profits, but because of the apartheid regime that was at the time, they couldn't take that money out of South Africa, invest it in other businesses in other countries. Or sorry, they couldn't invest it in other brewery-related businesses outside South Africa. So they were forced, therefore, to spend that money on other businesses, matchmaking, insurance company, hotels, none of which were related directly to their core business. Over the time, particularly during the 60s and 70s and even into the early 80s, there was a considerable number of conglomerates. So firms like these, GEC, Hanson Industries, Thorn EMI, TI or Tube Investments, UK-based firms which composed of a variety of different businesses, many of them with very little relationship between them. Some of these could be seen as ways of spending excess cash. Some of them could be seen as constructing a lower risk portfolio. And some of them could be seen perhaps as simply an ambitious manager growing his empire. So these were very successful for a period of time, but then their performance started to dip, and there was almost a fashion of moving away from conglomerates or unrelated diversification because they were seen to be not so successful. But that's not to say that conglomerates and unrelated diversification can't be successful. You're probably aware of Reggae Sauce, came to prominence through the Dragon's Den on TV. Many of you might not be able to identify this. Is it a turnip? Is it a carrot? No, it's sugar beet. You should all be familiar with tomatoes. And maybe some of you can identify the particular fashion cues from Primark. What's the link between these four different product areas? Different markets, different products, different technologies, different market growth rates. They are in fact all owned by one company, ABF, Associated British Foods. A 13 billion turnover company, operations in 50 countries, relatively prosperous, sees good growth, good return of dividends to its shareholders. But it's an unrelated, diversified business, which has shown some success. They're not as common as they were, but it is still a way of building a business and gaining growth for your shareholders. Related diversification is slightly different. Sometimes you can see similarities to the idea of integration. So a business might be integrated horizontally, it might have backward integration, or it might have forward integration, or it could possibly have all three. The key to related diversification or integration is the idea that there are key links between different businesses within the portfolio. So a car manufacturer in the middle of this diagram may buy competitors. So for a time we saw some of the big car manufacturers like Ford and General Motors buying up other car manufacturers smaller than themselves and in slightly different strategic groups. So that was a form of horizontal integration as they managed to then build a capability to compete across the whole car industry or car market. But then sometimes manufacturers may go for some form of backward integration, and you may remember that Porter talks about this in his 5 forces analysis. So a manufacturer may decide to buy up its machinery suppliers, or maybe some of the components or raw material suppliers. And the rationale for this will be to secure supplies, to manage the costs, maybe to capture specific technology that they require in their manufacturing. Or they may decide to go for some form of forward integration. So a car manufacturer may begin to buy up some of the dealers that sell their cars onto the end users. So related diversification can give control of suppliers, or it can give control of distribution, or both. And in this way, it gives access to greater experience and knowledge, which may be useful in their core business. It will enable them to at least make cost savings, and importantly, they'll be able to capture that profit which their suppliers or their intermediaries are making out of the product that they themselves are making. So they build a greater core competence in terms of the delivery of that final product to the end user. This diagram is designed to show how the performance of diversification, or the performance of diversified firms, can vary according to the level of diversification. What we see here in the left-hand corner, bottom left-hand corner, a single firm or a closely related small portfolio of businesses may be suffering from some poor performance. So they start to buy a number of different businesses and incorporate them into their portfolio. So there's the limited amount of diversification, but in the early days they start to see some benefits from this diversification. Their performance, particularly perhaps their revenue, starts to increase, and if they're skilled managers, then they can start to make sure that the whole operation is more efficient and their profitability increases. But as the diversification continues, and as perhaps it becomes less and less related, so businesses are being incorporated into the portfolio not because of their relation to other firms within the portfolio, but for some other criteria, perhaps because they are profitable. Then as we see perhaps that idea of trying to reduce the risk that the portfolio faces, the more we offset high risk, high performing businesses with low risk, stable businesses, then we start to see that the aggregate performance starts to decline. So the more it becomes unrelated, the more the performance decreases. And this has been the principal financial reason why the fashion, and it has been a fashion over the years, why the fashion for unrelated diversification has moved much closer to the concept of related diversification. So in order to operate diversification successfully, there does need to be a clear rationale. What's the basis for the diversification? Why are particular firms being acquired and incorporated into a portfolio? And the management has to be competent in assessing targets, doing the deals, and importantly, on integrating the new businesses into the portfolio. And very importantly, there has to be an appropriate and competent corporate structure in which to manage the whole portfolio. And this will be a subject of a later discussion on corporate parenting. There's some reading you should do in chapter 6 of the core textbook, and if you want to read more deeply into the whole area and history of diversification, then these 3 different readings are some of the seminal writings on diversification and performance.